That's good. Okay, so we'll talk about the classical philosophy after Aristotle today and on Wednesday. But before we do so, let's just briefly remember that we do have our first exam coming up. And I already had questions about it, even though we talked about it, but I guess it makes sense to talk about it again. So once again, it will be March 1st, next Monday. It will open at midnight between Sunday and Monday. So if for whatever reason you want to take it immediately, you can do so after midnight. But of course it would probably be a better idea to do it next day. And you can do it anytime until midnight between March 1st and March 2nd. Right? But because I know that despite all this, there's always people who somehow miss it for whatever reason. It will also be available on Tuesday. Note though that on Tuesday, if you take it on Tuesday, I'll take 10% penalty. So that's just like the last resort for people who, for whatever reason, didn't take it on time. It's still going to be available on Tuesday, but if I see that you took it after the deadline, I will deduct 10%. So for example, if you got 70%, it'll become 60. And if it is 60, it'll become 50, and so on. So don't do that. It's not a good idea. It's just I know that no matter how many times you say that, there's always at least a few people who miss the deadline. So may as well do it right away. Okay, make sure you prepare. Again, remember, you guys all hopefully have the review questions. Questions on the exam come from the review questions. There's not going to be anything which is not on the review questions. They will be multiple choice. You can pick whatever answer you think is the best, which of course helps a lot, unlike some sort of essay questions when sometimes you have no idea what to say. Here, even if you don't know the answer, you can just pick something and hope for the best. But of course the idea is that you should prepare. All these questions, we do discuss them specifically every time during the discussion, and there's still some left, and we will talk about it today, and we will talk about it next time. So if for whatever reason you are unsure about any of the questions, say you don't know something about Plato, you look at the Plato questions, you see a question there, something like, how did Plato believe we become aware of innate knowledge? I actually don't know the answer. So what do? Go back to the Plato discussion, watch it, and the answer is there. Naturally, it makes more sense if you do it as we go along, but if for whatever reason you didn't do it yet, well, there's still time, you can do it, but make sure you actually are prepared, because the last thing you want is to fail the exam. That'll obviously not going to be good for your grade. Homeworks are quite a bit easier, but the exam, that can possibly cause trouble to people who do not pay any attention, do not watch the videos, and just hope they will somehow sail into the good grade. Now, that obviously is not going to happen. Some people will get an A, some people will get a B, some people will get a C, some people will fail the class. It happens every time, and it's all in your hands. So go over the review, rewatch those videos. Hopefully you will all be well prepared. The exam will be again 45 minutes long. That's the time limit from the time you started. Make sure you have a nice, peaceful, quiet environment. Make sure that you have a reliable internet, because there's really nothing I can do if you, for example, somehow lose connection during the exam. It just gets automatically graded, and I can't give you a second chance, because once the grade is there, it's done. And so in that case, it's just bad luck. But hopefully that's not going to happen, right? So make sure you actually do have reliable internet and plenty of time to complete it peacefully without interruptions. And then after you're done, you will see your grade, and that will become part of the grade. But even if you do badly, don't panic too much, because I mean it's 1/4 of the grade, right? There's also extra credit. Hopefully you guys are doing extra credit, because that naturally will be very helpful in the end. Are there any questions about the exam? Nothing? Everything is clear? So again, 30 questions. All of them come from the review. 45 minutes maximum. You can take it anytime on March 1st. Okay, now let's move on to... No, it will be on Canvas. It's not on Mindtap. It's on Canvas. You will see it in a couple of days. I think it still is not visible there, but you will see it there. So it's not on Mindtap. Okay, let's again look back. This is some of the questions which you should know, right? And I also give extra credit if you know them. So it's pretty good way to prepare for the exam and get extra credit. So the first one is, what form of life, according to Aristotle, is the best? The best form of life. Spiritual. Aristotle. You are clearly confusing him with someone else. Remember, Plato was pointing upwards. Aristotle wasn't pointing upwards. So it's not really spiritual. Spiritual would be a little too spiritual for Aristotle. Enteleki, that means something has the purpose within. That's basically his explanation to why the change happens. Virtuously, well, it's kind of circular. Obviously, living virtuously is good, but what does that mean? What life is living virtuously? Realistic. Again, that's like, what's realistic? Okay, see, if it was on the exam, you may be confused, although it is multiple choice, so maybe that would not be too bad. But nonetheless, you do seem to be kind of confused a little bit. Remember, it is a life of rational contemplation. You want to be like God. And what is God doing? He is thinking. He is thinking all the time. Note that there's a difference between that being spiritual. It is rational contemplation. It is the thinking process. So do not confuse that with anything else. Rational contemplation is the correct answer. The life of rational contemplation. Now, what did Aristotle believe happiness to be? Eudaimonia is kind of happiness. So again, it's kind of circular. They translate that word into English as happiness. So happiness being happiness is obviously not very not very hard thing to guess. Okay, so that may again be a little bit difficult for you to answer like this. The final goal of everyone's activity. Final goal of everyone's activity. Doing what you like, again, what does that mean? What if you like killing people? Then what? Happiness is killing people? That clearly is not going to be Aristotle. It's the final goal of everyone's activity. Now, how everyone understands happiness, that's of course different. And Aristotle says that some people are confused about that and they actually don't know what their happiness is. But nonetheless, they still have the same goal. All of us have the goal of achieving happiness. It's just a different understanding of what it entails. Okay, what according to Aristotle are the 4 types of causes? Now you definitely should know this. Okay, Melissa, the first one. Yes, material, formal, efficient, and final. You should of course know that by now. Good job, Melissa. Final is one of them, but there's 4 of them, right? And finally, what is the doctrine of the mean according to Aristotle, and how does it relate to virtue? Any connection between virtue and the doctrine of the mean? What's the doctrine of the mean? What is the doctrine of the mean? What is mean? You guys probably took math or statistics or something, so you should know what the mean is. Average, yes. So, well, it's not exactly average, but yeah, it is more or less average. So, moderation, average, how does that relate to virtue though? Shouldn't act in excess. Yes, but in excess, in what sense? Now that seems to be exactly what was on the slide. Yeah, he did characterize it as mean between too little and too much, and it does concern with passion. But okay, so yeah, that's basically. But how does it relate to the mean? Well, yeah, between too little and too much. So let's say you want to do something. How do you figure out what is a virtuous action? How do you apply that to reality? Can you calculate it with some sort of a calculator? Well, intuition he is using for a different purpose, which is to figure out universals within experience. But I guess you can say that this type of intuition too. It's something which you should know, that comes from practice, from living your life and figuring out. But yeah, excess and deficiency should be avoided. So that's the mean. And the mean is not just arithmetical mean. It's not like you add up everything and divide it by half and that's your virtue. But in each situation it may be different. For example, you don't want to be too stingy with money, but you also don't want to be too showing off too much, spending so much that it's actually not reasonable. So everything should come in moderation indeed. It should be, you should have some sort of good sense of the correct amount in each case. So that's the connection with the virtue. Virtue is the correct balance between the extremes. This is the best answer for this. Correct balance between these extremes. Okay, well, let's move on now, because we do need to go over the new material. Now we kind of passed the great towering figures of Plato and Aristotle. We'll talk a little bit about philosophy after Plato and Aristotle, but still before well, probably before Christianity, because we will talk a little bit about Christianity after we are done with the exam next week, when we talk about medieval times. So what was going on during this rather large period of time? This period of time is known as Hellenistic. Prior to that was Hellenic period. Helena is Greece. Hellenistic, why we call it Hellenistic? Because at this point it's becoming quasi-Greek. At this point the Greek civilization has spread up over such a vast territory and became kind of mixed up with all sorts of other cultures. So it's no longer purely Greek, but it still has connection to that, because they still spoke the same essentially language, except that, like I mentioned before, it's known as Koine Greek, more of a simplified version of classical Greek, but nonetheless very, very similar. And then after that there is a Roman period, when the Roman Empire kind of came into prominence. This is the two big periods which kind of both are related to the philosophy we'll be talking about right now. Okay, so it starts roughly from the time of the death of Alexander the Great and the death of Aristotle. They're just 1 year apart. Alexander the Great died in 323. Aristotle, remember, 322 after he ran away from Athens. This is when the Hellenistic period starts. Now, what is special about this period? Well, for one thing, there was a very dramatic change in the political life in Greece. Prior to that, they had these small poli, small towns, which all had their own government. Now it becomes more centralized. Alexander the Great already started that process. So it becomes like an empire. They have government which is kind of really far away, and it sends whatever laws, whatever regulations it thinks necessary to all these little communities. But the government is no longer this kind of local democratically elected government. It becomes a lot less personal. It's a little bit like the federal government here, right? It's overwhelmingly in control of everything, but in the same time it's kind of far away in Washington, D.C., and we don't really see it very much. But all those social conditions against which Socrates reacted, remember the social conditions we talked about in Athens, which, among others, loss of belief in traditional gods, the disappointment with how life was going. All of this actually remained and became even worse. So for this reason, it was even new approach to philosophy. Even less of an attention was paid from that period of time to issues such as how reality is made and so on. And it became more the question of individualistic approach. How do I become happy? So what people expected from philosophy is, well, more or less probably what most of us expect today too. What does it do for me? How does it make me happy? How does it make my life more meaningful? Is there something for me to strive for? So it is very interesting for us again too, because it's a lot more applicable to us than some of the other periods. Now, 7 prominent movements of the time. Well, the first 2 we're not going to talk about at all, or maybe tiny little bit. Plato's school. What happened to Plato's school? Remember the academy. It was still there for hundreds of years. Now they became known as academics. Academics slowly became more skeptical, so when we talk about skepticism next time we will mention them. That's what was happening with his school. Now Peripatetics, that's actually the followers of Aristotle. Peripatos means walk, and they were kind of walking around there in Athens, so they were known as Peripatetics. What did they do? They mainly started doing this empirical observation, scientific approach, science, which makes sense, right? We're not going to talk about them. Today we'll talk about the Cynicism and Epicureanism. This is 2 of the major movements, especially Epicureanism of the period. And then next time we'll talk about Stoicism and Skepticism. This is the other 2. Unfortunately, we don't really have much time for Neoplatonism, but we will mention it next week after the exam. Okay, so this is the main movements. Cynicism. What was the deal with cynicism? We actually use this word right now, right, in English. We say, oh, he's such a cynic. What do we mean? Well, it's not exactly the same thing. Nonetheless, how did it begin? Antisthenes. That's one of the actually students of Gorgias. Remember, Gorgias was a sophist, and he was also devoted follower of Socrates. So we kind of going back to Socrates in that sense. He thought that the true value is in the soul, not in material possessions. So Cynics actually rejected everything material, life of material gain completely. Live according to virtue. That's all you need to do. So remember the distinction between physis and nomos. We did mention it when we talked about sophists. So again, physis is living according to nature, or whatever is related to nature. Nomos is the human laws, human traditions, everything humans kind of invested into living. So not surprisingly, Cynics thought that you should always follow physis. In fact, they were so literal about that they even had things like sex in public. They thought it was fine. Why should we hide? Animals don't hide. What's wrong with sex? Very natural. So they would have sex, they would relieve themselves in public. They did not wash themselves very much because they again thought that was unnatural. Why would you wash yourself? Animals don't really do that, so we shouldn't do it either. So they were kind of dirty, shabby, walking around, stinky, and generally considering that the best way to happiness. Why? Well, if you don't have anything, nothing can be taken away from you. You don't really worry about anything anymore. You've given it all up. You only care about your soul and virtue, and that's pretty much it. Suffering itself, they thought, was good. That's excellent. If you suffer, it helps you reach freedom from emotions. Battle your desires. Your desires are what brings you down. Every time you desire something, that makes you unsettled, that makes you unhappy. And by the way, that we will see that in Stoics, when we talk about Stoics, that actually is something they took from Cynics, and which is very important to Stoic philosophy, and even a little bit in Epicureanism, which we will talk about later today. So again, being steered up by any kind of emotion is actually bad for you, including emotion of pleasure, because pleasure comes and goes very quickly, but then you feel bad about not having it anymore. So you should not care about earthly possessions, you should not care about pleasure, and of course you should not care about wealth, reputation, even things like freedom, because if you're too concerned about those, it again makes you vulnerable to all sorts of calamities, when in fact you should just live this natural, one would say animal type of life. There's nothing wrong with poverty, shame, loss of freedom, and even things like illness and death. I mean, let's face it, we all die sometime, so why worry about that? Diogenes of Sinops, and by the way, there are many Diogeneses at that time in Greece, so don't get them all confused. We will see this name pop up now and then for different people. So for this reason, they are distinguished from which town they come from. He comes from Sinops, so he is Diogenes of Sinops, is one of the most famous cynics. You may have heard about him. He was also known as the dog. Mad Socrates. They also referred to him as Mad Socrates, because remember Socrates, well, even though he was of course wise and everything, but he was also not washing himself very frequently, walking around barefoot and shabby dressed. So Diogenes took it to a whole new level. He just basically lived as poorly and horribly as you can imagine. In Athens, was completely dirty, unwashed. He is known for several stories. We don't know exactly how true they are, but this is what this type of anecdotes we got from antiquity explaining this individual. So one of them is that once he was walking around at noonday with a lantern, and they asked him, Diogenes, why do you need a lantern during the daytime? It's sunny. And he says, I'm looking for an honest man. And to find an honest man, I need an extra light, because it's not easy these days. This is the painting of him supposedly walking around like this. We will see that Nietzsche actually will use that in his philosophy. So this is from, of course, much later painting Diogenes searching for an honest man. Another famous anecdote about him has to do with Alexander the Great. Supposedly, when Alexander the Great visited Corinth, where at the time Diogenes was, he was very impressed. So he approached Diogenes. You see, this is the Diogenes sitting there on a street. This is Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great approached him and said, "Oh, my dear man, could you please tell me, is there anything I can do for you? You know, I'm one of the most powerful people in the world. I can do anything for you. What would you like?" Diogenes just looked at him and said, "Can you stand away from the light?" so that's the only request he had. So supposedly the sun was like somewhere over there or something, and he was enjoying the sun. See, and Alexander was blocking it. So the only request from the most powerful, one of the most powerful people in the world, was stand off the light. No other wishes. Now, like I said, to Stoics that would actually contribute to their philosophy somewhat. This concern for virtue, for one thing, the idea that the virtue is the most important thing, more important than earthly possessions. Also, the importance of the independence from worldly cares, something should not disturb you too much, and liberation from the confines of culture. The fact that culture is not necessarily a good thing, that it is something which humans invented and it kind of dragging them down. Now, let's discuss it a little bit. So, what do you guys think? Do Cynics have something in common with Socrates? Can you see some similarity there? Yeah, so what? Yeah, so that attitude towards worldly possession, the idea that you should care about your soul more than anything else, that certainly has a close connection to Socrates. Mannerism, I don't know if it's the right word, but yeah, like the way they dress, living in virtue. Now, another interesting question: in what way were the ancient Cynics similar to or different from what we call Cynics today? When we say he's a cynic, do we mean the same thing? No, because yeah, like most Cynics no longer seem to care about virtue, right? What do Cynics mostly care about? Like, but there is some similarity. Well, definitely. So, what's the similarity though? What is there? Why do we keep on calling people cynics, even though they clearly do not subscribe to probably any philosophy? Well, the disregard for nomos. Remember, nomos, the human law, human custom, human tradition. Now, that definitely is why. Because cynics today, we also call people cynical when they just disregard the whatever customs we have. If somebody would, for example, again, relieve themselves in public or something, well, that may be too strong just to call them cynical, but that kind of has this kind of flavor, right? We would say, "Ooh, he's so cynical." Or if somebody says something which is like completely out of way people commonly talk about something, when somebody, for example, if you're talking about war heroes or something and somebody says something negative, we would say, "Oh, it's so cynical." So that's kind of where it connects, but they disregard nomos. They still, when somebody disregards nomos, when somebody disregards this kind of human laws and traditions, we do still call them cynical. Okay, I don't think that the modern cynics don't care about life, though. That's probably not where they are similar. That's definitely a difference, because I think if a person is cynical, well, he might not care about life, but that's really not necessary. He could care about life a little too much, even. Okay, Cyrenaics. Now, this is kind of already transition into Epicurus. Why do we care about them? Because this is the early form of what is known as hedonism. Hedonism again comes from the Greek hedone, which is pleasure, the word for pleasure. People who see value in pleasure. The first person, again, not surprisingly, was one of the followers of Socrates. Note that Socrates kind of started all these movements by essentially students who followed him later becoming heads of various schools. That's one of the ways why we can consider him the father of philosophy. So Aristotle was the person who started this supposedly Cyrenaic movement, even though he never consciously wanted to start the movement, but he is known to be one of the first people who actually said that the immediate pleasure, this kind of physical sensory pleasure, is the only value in life. Now that seems like very strange for a follower of Socrates to say, but people are all different. Maybe he followed Socrates, tried to figure out whether Socrates had something valuable to say, and then maybe he decided that not really. Socrates is like not on the right track. And this is kind of a more rude, crude version of hedonism, because the hedonism of Epicurus would be a lot more sophisticated than that. But this is what people usually mean when they say, oh, he's a hedonist, or Epicurean. Today, when people talk about Epicurus, they typically think that this is a person who just values pleasure above all, but as you will hopefully see, this is not quite the case, and that's the difference. So who was Epicurus? He's quite a bit younger. He could not have possibly followed Socrates because he was born in 341, so that's like what, 58 years after the death of Socrates. Never met Socrates, never even met Plato, because when Plato died he was a child. But nonetheless, he became a head of the very, very well-known school, Epicureanism. This is one of his representations. Supposedly he looked like this. Around 307 he came to Athens and purchased a garden on the edge of Athens, where he created this kind of community. It actually has a lot of similarity to Pythagoreans. Remember Pythagoreans, kind of religious community? It wasn't the same, but there's some similarity. They lived together and they had him as the head, kind of a type of a sect, you may say. He was teaching them and they were listening to him. One of the differences, though, they were not sharing property. Pythagoreans had everything in common, not Epicureans. They had their own property, so they didn't have to give up their possessions when they joined this community. It proved very, very attractive philosophy. Hopefully you'll see why. It was taught by catechisms. That's kind of a form of short teachings which is easy to memorize. Again, similar to Pythagoreans, they had some catechisms too. Now, what exactly was he trying to achieve? Well, again, not surprisingly, happiness. That's about happiness. How do we achieve happiness? The whole point of philosophy, Epicurus was saying, is to achieve happiness. Empty is the argument of the philosopher by which no human disease is healed. For just as there is no benefit in medicine if it does not drive out body diseases, so there is no benefit in philosophy if it does not drive out the diseases of the soul. So what did he teach? Well, one of the important contributions is his idea of physical reality. Physics was kind of part of the teaching because he thought that even though the most important thing is to be happy, but in order to be happy we have to understand a little bit of how the world works, right? So he borrowed the idea of atomism from Democritus. Remember Democritus, he is the first one who actually suggested atoms. Now, for Aristotle never thought that reality is made of any kind of small chunks. Aristotle actually thought that it is kind of a continuum. But Democritus suggested, the first one, remember, suggested that there are these tiny little particles, which they called atoms. Atomos means indivisible. So that's literally what it means. And Epicurus picked it up. He actually thought it was a good idea, but he disagreed with Democritus in one important sense. Democritus didn't think there could be a void. He didn't think there could be, completely empty space which had nothing in it. But Epicurus actually suggested that there is void. It's the distance between those atoms. Note that this is kind of a very modern idea. This is how physicists has been thinking about it for centuries, even though right now it's kind of difficult to say whether it's the most recent way to describe reality, but for many centuries they did. And if you take a beginner level physics class, this is also how it's typically taught. It's only later that they may go into more complicated explanations. So we think of reality as indeed being made of atoms, and there is a void or empty space between them. Now, why did he think we need atoms? Well, the same arguments as were perplexing philosophers before, because if you can divide everything infinitely, that seems like there will be nothing there. It seems like you will not have this kind of hard reality which we see around us, right? So it kind of makes sense that there should be some sort of tiny little chunks of matter. Also remember Zeno's paradoxes. The way Zeno's paradoxes work is by basically rejecting this idea of a smallest particle. That's why you cannot explain how you can how the Achilles can run faster than the tortoise and so on. So Epicurus thought that no, that actually, in order to explain it, you need these small chunks. Note that they are not, they have certain size, certain very tiny size, so you can figure out how big they are if you were able to, look not with human eyes, but with something like, well, today we call microscope, right? So the size is there. You just cannot split them. They cannot be divided. That's why they are atomos, indivisible. And all reality contains is made up of these little chunks. They have different weight, they have different size, and they have different shapes. So some of them may be like more spiky. That's partly how they were explaining, for example, why do you have bitter food? Well, the atoms there are spiky. When you eat it, they kind of sharp, and your tongue can feel it. Same thing with like some sort of sharp objects. The atoms are spiky. Some atoms are more smooth, some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, and they also have tendency, just like stones, to fall down. But they are colliding as they doing that. And this is actually, interestingly enough, how he was explaining freedom of the will. So this is like a full-blown materialism. The entire reality is made of atoms and the void. There's literally nothing else, including our soul. The human soul, according to Epicurus, is actually made up of atoms. They are just different from atoms from which, for example, a stone is made. They are very, very delicate, but atoms nonetheless. And they are connected with the atoms of our body. So what happens when we die? The whole thing disperses. For this reason, he actually did not believe in life after death. He thought when we die, atoms disperse, and that's it. That's the end of us. So there's like a soul, but that soul is nothing but this collection of atoms which are bunched up together with our body in a particular way. While the whole thing holds together, that's when you have this person. So how about freedom of the will? Because note that this is one of the big problems with materialism. How do you account for the freedom of the will if everything is material? If everything is material, shouldn't everything then follow the strict laws of physics? And if it does, what is freedom of the will? Now it will become even more problem later. Epicurus actually tried to explain it in the following way. Since these atoms are, colliding with each other in a random way, they, when they fall down, they can do so in an unpredictable way, so without following any kind of laws. And for this reason, you have chance. You have this kind of random stuff. And that's how you can explain freedom of the will. Not everything is determined. Now, do you think this kind of spontaneous deviation actually explains freedom of the will? What could be the problem there? What do you guys think? Could there be a problem? This is an interesting question, right? We all kind of wonder, do we have freedom of the will? Can we just literally do whatever or not? And right now, again, based on physics and everything, it does kind of seem, but more or less scientific viewpoint is materialist. But then if everything is made of matter, how do you account for the freedom of the will? Does his explanation work? So those atoms which made up our soul or whatever, when they collide, they can accidentally go in variety of directions. Is that an explanation? Well, that's the good question. Can you actually measure it? I guess Epicurus would say no, because it's unpredictable. That's his point. These atoms can go any way they want, by pure chance. But does it make sense? There will be a lot of criticism of this idea later on as we go closer towards our time. This is like one of the early versions. Let's, for example, compare it with Plato. What would Plato say? How would Plato explain freedom of the will? So remember that this is kind of a beauty in a sense of Plato's explanation. According to Plato, the physical reality is not even real. That is more or less an illusion. The real is spiritual. So it's not even the other realm. It's the only realm. And what we see around us is kind of like this shadows on the wall. Remember the allegory of the cave? It's not real objects. It's the shadows. The real objects are actually forms, and that is where the freedom of the will can very comfortably reside. But if you go down this kind of more materialist approach, the question inevitably arises. Okay, everything is made of atoms, including our soul. Atoms interact with each other because of physical laws, right? Now, note that at the time, they didn't know as much about physical laws. So that's why it made sense for Epicurus to say, well, they just unpredictable. But today, when we studied so much, and that as we again go closer to our time, you will see it coming up more and more and more, that the more people got scientific explanations for everything, the more they realized the only way we don't know how these atoms interact is because we haven't actually learned it yet. but theoretically you can know it. You can learn all these laws. In which case it really seems like there's no longer any room for freedom of the will. It seems that freedom of the will is completely gone from the picture. So that's what creates the problem. Like if you explain it in a purely materialist way, the way Epicurus does, then of course you do run into this problem. Freedom of the will does seem to disappear. He thought that it actually is compatible, but as again we will later talk about it more, no, it's not really compatible with that. There is a problem there. There's definitely a problem. Okay, so now based on all this materialism, that kind of explains a little bit more about his philosophy. He thought we should only trust perception. Perception doesn't lie, even though people can still get things wrong, but that's not because perception lies. Our sensual experience is absolutely true. If you feel that there's an object there, there must be an object there. But the way the way our mind operates, we create errors by misunderstanding the perception. But nonetheless, everything is related to perception, so it's not hard to understand why he say that the road to happiness is to pursue pleasure and avoid pain. Pleasure is good, pain is evil. Very simple, and he was saying, well, even children understand it, right? From the earliest age, that's what children do. You pursue pleasure and you avoid pain. But again, the difference with Cyrenaics is that he had a more complex explanation. He was saying that there is such thing as too much pleasure, and there are such things as wrong pleasures, things which people think are pleasurable, but they are not. So the goal of wisdom, the goal of wise person is actually not to have as much pleasure as possible, but to achieve ataraxia. Ataraxia is the freedom from care. So that's actually the real pleasure. He was saying that there are kinetic pleasures, the moving pleasures, and pleasures which are more static or kind of peaceful. So just to give you an example, when you enjoy a good movie or a good food, that's kinetic pleasure because it's kind of a process. What he would say is actually more valuable pleasure is just having peace of mind, just not worrying about bad things happening. So that's a very strange way to look at pleasure, but nonetheless he thought that's the real pleasure. The real pleasure is the absence of pain, absence of distress. So absence of pain, aponia, and absence of distress, ataraxia. That's the two Greek words he was using, explaining how we can actually achieve pleasure. So ataraxia results from ridding ourselves from fears of God and death. Among other things, this was an important part of their philosophy. He thought that fearing God actually disturbs you, and you are not very happy when you fear God. Similarly, you shouldn't fear death, because that's one of the biggest fears all human beings have, and Epicureans were known to reject that. They thought that you shouldn't fear death, even though know that there's no life after death. But they thought it's actually even better, because if there was life after death, then you may worry about hell. You may worry about being responsible. But if there's no life after death, what is there to worry about? It's just nothing. Also maximizing your independence of fortune by minimizing your needs. So in that sense, it's closer to cynics, right? You're saying the less you actually need, the better chances you have of happy life. And knowing how your bodily pain, if it comes your way, can be endured. So we all experience pain. Sometimes you have to be able to endure it well. So avoidance of pain is the most important part of this philosophy. And for this reason, again, not every pleasure is to be pursued. Many pleasures are actually more painful. Why? Well, while again you have this pleasure, you obviously are enjoying it, but then it ends. And that may be a lot more unpleasant than not to have it in the first place, right? We all know that, right? Sometimes you have something so nice and so pleasurable, and then when it's gone, it's like, oh my God, but I enjoyed it so much. I'm like so much more miserable now because I don't have it anymore. So that's exactly the point there. The best pleasures, he was saying, are mental pleasures. Friendship, among other things. He really valued friendship. He thought that this is one of the biggest pleasures you can have. Otherwise, just avoid painful experiences and, of course, get whatever you need, food, water, but on more or less basic level. So the distinction was like this. All desires, he was saying, can be divided into groundless and natural. Now, groundless desires such as fame, material luxuries, should not be pursued at all. You do not need that. Jewelry, designer clothes. Epicurus would say it's just stupid. Note how different it is from when we today say somebody is Epicurean. We actually mean that they go after this kind of material goods. But the traditional Epicurean philosophy was not like that. So this is all groundless desires. Avoid them. What are natural desires? Well, there are two types of natural desires. Necessary and unnecessary. What are natural and necessary desires? Well, desires for happiness, comfort, for life itself. They all, of course, natural, necessary. So, for example, wisdom, friendship, adequate clothing, adequate food. That's all necessary. What is unnecessary? Delicious foods. He would say all this fancy, restaurant food. It's unnecessary. Note that it's not necessarily groundless, because we all enjoy that, right? If you eat tasty food, that is kind of a natural to us to enjoy that. But Epicurus would say it still is not very good for you. Why? Because again, you enjoy this delicious food, and then what happens? Either you don't have any more money for it, or, well, even if you do have enough money, you keep on eating the same thing, eventually you will not be enjoying it. So it kind of leads to this vicious circle when you keep on looking for it and get addicted to this pursuit of pleasure, and you end up being more miserable than you were before. We all know that, and Epicurus noticed that, so he actually thought that we should avoid it to begin with. And if we avoid it to begin with, then of course our life would be a lot more pleasurable. And virtue in that sense, again, to Epicurus, is just measured in terms of pleasure, but not again that this is not the kind of pleasure where you just enjoy tasty food. The pleasure of friendship, the pleasure of wisdom, the pleasure of good company, this is the kinds of pleasures which are leading to virtue. One must honor the noble and the virtuous and things like that if they produce pleasure, but if they do not, one must bid them goodbye. That's what Epicurus was teaching. Now, based again on all that stuff, their social philosophy was also very withdrawn. He thought that, it's not really good for you to get involved in politics. You should obey the law. Why? Well, because if you don't obey the law, then you will be punished. And that's not pleasurable at all. But don't get involved in politics. Don't get involved in all this democracy and other stuff. Why? Well, it disturbs you again. It steers you up. And if it steers you up, then you're not happy. But the point is to be happy. Note that it is very individualistic philosophy, and in particular, if you look at this such issue as justice, remember justice in the Republic, there's distinction of justice into these three categories: things good for themselves and for their consequences, things good for themselves but not for their consequences, things good for their consequences but not for themselves. So Epicurus would actually disagree with Plato on that for sure. He would say, no, justice is one of those things which is not pleasurable in itself, but only for its consequences. Why should you be just person? Well, because if you're not, other people will not respect you, they will treat you badly, and so you will suffer. That will be pain. But justice in itself is not really a pleasurable thing, because, there's really not much pleasure in it. It's not like even conversation with friends. It's more of something we all have to do, because that's how we achieve this kind of balance in the society. So rather selfish, and in that sense, of course, when people today say somebody is Epicurean, they do mean something like that, something that somebody only cares about his own pleasure rather than the good of the society. But this story is not as simple again, because he thought still you should be with friends. It's kind of difficult to reconcile that, because not that there is a problem in terms of, like, say, friendship. What is the true friendship? Should you really pursue your own pleasure when you are friends with somebody? Because if you do, is it even a true friendship? And if you don't, well, then that seems like kind of contradict this type of philosophy. But Epicurus thought that it was perfectly compatible, and he actually had very good friends himself. He is known to be an excellent friend and an excellent person to be friends with. Now, religion and death. Again, remember, it's materialism. So he was saying you should not fear gods. He never actually rejected gods. He never said there are no gods. In fact, he was accepting the idea that there are gods, and funny enough, they were also material. They were made of atoms, just like we are. So how are they then gods? Oh, it's different types of atoms. The atoms they are made of are not the same atoms as we are made of, and for this reason they actually are eternal. They are eternal. Nonetheless, Epicurus thought they do not care about humans at all. Like, they couldn't care less. They are enjoying themselves. That's what gods do. In fact, this is a quote, gods are Epicureans, right? They spend their time in such a manner that nothing can be conceived which is more blessed or better supplied with all kinds of good things. For a god is idle, is entangled with no serious preoccupations, undertakes no toilsome labor, but simply rejoices in his own wisdom and virtue, being certain that he will always be in the midst of pleasures which are both supreme and eternal. So, gods, according to Epicurus, are just enjoying themselves because they are eternal. They have everything they want. And for this reason, we shouldn't be afraid of them, because, again, they just don't care about us. They don't hurt us, and they don't help us. In fact, they seem to be completely useless in that sense. But they may as well not exist. One would suspect that with his philosophy, he should probably say they don't exist. I'm not sure why he allowed them to exist in this way. Maybe because he didn't want to have any trouble with the authorities. That could be one of the explanations. Like, why, remember, the Socrates was accused of not believing in gods and executed. So maybe Epicurus thought that it's a little too risky to suggest that there is no gods. So how about we suggest there are gods, but they just completely detached from the world. And finally, the fear of death is an important part of his philosophy, that we should not be afraid of death. But if there's no soul, or as a soul is destroyed the moment we die, how is that possible? Isn't it exactly what we're afraid of? Well, he was saying, this is a rather famous thing, and many people repeated it after that. He was saying, if we exist, then death does not, and if death exists, then we do not. So what he actually means is, we never experience death, as in, like, you're never going to know you are dead. When you are dead, there's nothing to know, and there's no you. While there's still you, there's no death. So that's exactly what he means. He was saying, get used to believing that death is nothing to us. For all good and bad consists in sense experience, and death is the privation of sense experience. Hence, a correct knowledge of the fact that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life a matter of contentment, not by adding a limitless time to the life, but by removing the longing for immortality. So basically, enjoy it while it lasts, and that's perfectly okay that at one point it will stop. You won't even know that. And he was saying it doesn't even matter if your life is long or short, because compared to eternity, it's all short. What's the difference 100 years, 20 years, compared to billions of years? Compared to billions of years, neither of them is long or short. It's all just like a little tiny speckle of time. So just enjoy it. That's the idea. Are you guys convinced about that? Do you agree with him that we shouldn't fear death? Okay, John is convinced. That's good. Anybody not convinced? I mean, what could be the problem here? What objections can we come up with to this? Be prepared. How do you do that? How do you prepare for death? Now, I mean, it is a fine, I guess, idea, but is it realistic for us to really think about it in this way? I mean, there's one thing about, understanding that and saying, yeah, that's completely true, and even I agree with that. And it's a different thing to actually not fear death, because let's face it, if any of us is in immediate danger of death, like in a shooting or something situation, who there would be like, hey, I remember what Epicurus said, and based on that, I just don't care. Shoot me, whatever. Can anybody be like that? Do you think Epicurus would be like that? I mean, yeah, like it's all fine in theory, but in reality, well, for one thing, if you are aware of the fact that you may be shot, for example, well, let's just say it's not a very pleasant experience, regardless of death. I mean, even if you don't die, that's not fun. And I'm sure that the people who are shot to death do experience something, right? There is like this moment when you are not dead yet, but you already know that you are being mortally wounded, which definitely is not fun. And it's kind of hard to take this kind of attitude like, hey, I don't care. Well, how can you not care about that? I mean, on one hand, theoretically, yeah, like it does seem like you shouldn't care, but we're all, again, humans. So, yeah, that does seem a little bit problematic. I mean, again, remember there's different deaths, right? Some people die when they're like 90 years old in their sleep and they never even know about it. Fair enough. Some people are like taken hostages and tortured and then, I don't know, tortured to death. And that certainly doesn't sound like something you could take very lightly. It certainly doesn't seem like... yeah, so there's all sorts of situations, and some of them definitely are a lot less pleasant than others. But he does have a point, doesn't he? That having too much fear of death is poisoning our lives. If you worry about it too much, it definitely would not be good. Here you can actually remember that Aristotle's doctrine of the mean. Like, you can be a little bit afraid of the death, but not too much. Like the right amount of fear. Don't be so careless that you expose yourself to dangerous situation. Obviously, if there is like a shooting or something, you should hide. That just makes sense. Nobody wants to be shot. But in the same time, don't live your life fearing of death all the time. Because if you do, then you will spoil it while you're still alive. Right? You see the point there? That definitely is not something you want to think about all the time. Do you guys agree? But in terms of whether or not there is life after death, that he may have a point there, because indeed if you believe in life after death and the judgment, then it does seem to be a little bit unsettling, or maybe a lot unsettling. Because one thing, like, they say, who is without sin, right? Is anybody can say, honestly, I lived my life in such a noble way that there's absolutely nothing there I can be held accountable for? I doubt it. But for majority of us, there's kind of a combination of like good deeds and bad deeds, things we're proud of and things we are not so proud of. Hopefully nothing too terrible, like most people don't commit murder and stuff. But nonetheless, you may wonder, like, when I actually, if after death there's some sort of judgment, would I be actually, go to paradise, or would I be going to hell? And that can be very unsettling. Just a few days ago, I actually was looking at TikTok, and there's this girl who is very Catholic, and she had this TikTok saying, "Oh my God, I'm so afraid of hell. This is like one of my biggest fears." So she actually is afraid that after she dies, she goes to hell. I don't know why she didn't elaborate on that, but I guess that could be a possibility for all of us, right? And so that does seem to be a little bit unsettling. So on that point, Epicurus is saying, oh, don't worry. There's no hell. There's no life after death. It's just all ended when it's ended, and that's it. Very modern ideas. Note that this type of materialism will again come back and is still with us today. So that's one of the reasons why this philosophy is so important and influential. It's very significant in general because this individualism and withdrawal, which are at the heart of this whole period, again, are still very much present in the society today. It's always present, and we have to understand like how to approach that. And it's a big contrast with Plato and Aristotle. For Plato and Aristotle, good life is found in more of an involvement in political life, for Aristotle in particular, and even for Plato to some degree. But definitely for Aristotle, this kind of active life. But in this case, you see a little bit more of a life of withdrawal. How do you achieve this ataraxia? Well, don't get involved with anything, really. Just be in this garden, enjoying your friends, enjoying this frugal food, just maybe a piece of bread. If you're very hungry, will be so enjoyable to you. You don't need anything fancy, just some water, simple things like that. Okay, anyway. And yeah, it is still relevant for us today. We still see many people thinking in exactly this sense. We will see, like with Mill and with utilitarianism, how these ideas were becoming more complex as we get closer to our time. But nonetheless, the idea behind it is still the same. In the end of the day, we all pursue pleasure. It just seems to be one of these realities. There's two types of hedonism you can distinguish in philosophy. Psychological hedonism would be just saying that, this is what people do. It's not necessarily a good thing, but this is what the reality is. People do pursue pleasure. You may think it's bad, but it happens all the time. So it's not necessarily the same thing as to saying it's a good thing to pursue pleasure, and we should do that, as seems to be the case with especially Cyrenaics. But it is kind of a reality. And a lot of people who talk about other things, spiritual things and so on, you can see them really, again, pursuing pleasures, right? Just one famous example is all these Catholic priests who are being constantly caught with all sorts of scandals, sex-related scandals and so on. And again, you start wondering, like, These people preach one thing, but do they actually follow that? Doesn't seem like they follow that. They don't seem to be too afraid of hell, for judging by what they do in this life. So maybe it is a more honest and more honest approach to just accept that and say, just like Epicureans, yeah, we pursue pleasure. Let's just find which pleasure is the best, because there's really nothing else to life but that. Okay, anyway, so we don't really have any new reading or anything for Wednesday, but if you haven't finished the chapter, please finish it, because we will talk about Stoicism next time. Very, very interesting philosophy. By the way, kind of relevant right now with all this pandemic and everything. They've been mentioning it a few times, because this kind of Stoic attitude does indeed seem to be more comforting. It has some similarity with Epicureanism, but is a lot more interesting, because there is more nuance to that. It was very popular in Rome, so Romans accepted it much better than Epicureanism, because of its kind of more austere ideal. It is related to these philosophies we talked about today, but kind of more interesting, complex, and it had a very, very large effect on Western society. In particular, the ideas of liberalism and so on, all these ideas are closely related to Stoicism. So make sure if you didn't read the chapter, and then next time we will talk about that. Okay, do you guys have any questions or concerns we can address in the last few minutes? Well, thank you. If it's all, then I guess we can wrap it up, unless somebody has anything. I hope you are preparing for the exam, and I will then see you on Wednesday. Same time as usual. Slides on canvas. Well, one thing I don't want people to do is just look up the answers on the slides. That's kind of a very lazy way to do it. And for this reason, I'm trying not to put the slides, but rather put the videos, because it's all on the videos, right? You can see the slides right here, but then you do need to watch the videos rather than watch the slides. So it's kind of all there anyway, but I would rather do it this way. Pretty much the only thing about this class which you need to do is read the book and watch the videos, right? So I do really expect you guys to do that. Okay, have a good day, and I'll see you on Wednesday. That's all we have.